let me paint you a picture. It is 1815. You are the most powerful man on the planet. You have personally won more than 60 battles. You have rewritten the legal systems of half of Europe. You have placed your own brothers and sisters on the thrones of Spain, Holland, Naples, and Westphalia. You have made emperors and kings bow to you. You have fought the greatest military powers in the world and beaten them so consistently that your enemies stopped sleeping properly at night, just knowing you existed. And then, in 100 days, you lose everything, not slowly, not gradually, not through years of decline. In 100 days, the length of a bad semester in college, you go from Emperor of France, returned triumphantly from exile to a country that lined the roads to cheer for, you too, prisoner on a tiny island in the South Atlantic, where you will spend the remaining 6 years of your life arguing with your British jailer about whether you are allowed to go for walks. That is the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, and it is simultaneously the most impressive and most catastrophic arc in the history of human ambition. But here is what everyone gets wrong about Napoleon. The 100 days at the end, the final collapse, is not the interesting part. The interesting part is how a nobody from a minor Corsican family climbed to the absolute top of the most powerful civilization on Earth in less than 15 years. The interesting part is the military genius that made professional soldiers from 5 different countries simultaneously decide that fighting Napoleon directly was a terrible idea. The interesting part is what he built, why it mattered, and exactly how he managed to destroy it himself, with a series of decisions so baffling that historians are still arguing about them 200 years later. Oh, and was he actually short? We'll get to that. The answer is more interesting than you think. But first, welcome to Sketchy Past, fast history, zero fluff, pure chaos. If you've been riding with us through Caesar, Attila, Alexander, and the Mongols, you already know what this is. If you are new, subscribe right now, ring the bell, and join the sketchy empire. Napoleon would tell you that showing up early is how you win. He proved it about 60 times before he forgot his own advice. Let's go. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on the 15th of August, 1769, in Ajaccio, Corsica. And the timing matters more than almost anything else about his early life. Corsica had been a Genoese territory for centuries. In 1768, 1 year before Napoleon was born, Genoa sold the island to France. This means Napoleon was born a French citizen by the skin of his teeth, through an accident of geopolitical timing that had nothing to do with him or his family. The Bonapartes were minor Corsican nobility. Not poor exactly, but not wealthy by any meaningful standard. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer with political ambitions and 8 children to feed. The family had enough status to make claims on aristocratic privilege, but not enough money to back those claims up comfortably. Napoleon was the second surviving child. He was not, by any external measure, the obvious candidate for world domination. What he was, from the earliest accounts, was relentlessly, almost aggressively driven. He was sent to French military schools at age 9, first a preparatory school at Autun, then the military academy at Brienne. He was small. He spoke French with a Corsican accent that his classmates mocked. He had no money and no social connections, and he was studying in a country that was not quite his own. His response to all of this was to work harder than everyone around him. He was obsessive about mathematics, history, and geography, the 3 subjects most directly applicable to military command. He read everything. He took notes obsessively. He slept less than everyone else and studied more. He graduated from the École Militaire in Paris in 1 year, a program that typically took 2 or 3, and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery at age 16. Artillery, this choice matters. In the French army of the 1780s, the artillery was considered less prestigious than the cavalry or the infantry. It was where officers without money or connections ended up. Napoleon chose it anyway, or was placed there anyway, and spent his early career mastering every technical and tactical aspect of how artillery worked. This would later prove to be one of the decisive advantages of his military career. Napoleon understood artillery the way most generals understood infantry, intuitively, completely. with an ability to see in real time how cannon fire could be used to break an enemy formation before the infantry ever made contact. He used artillery as an offensive weapon in ways that his contemporaries simply weren't doing, and the results were devastating. But in 1785, none of that mattered yet. He was a 16-year-old second lieutenant from Corsica with no money, no connections, and a future that looked, at best, moderately promising. The French Revolution happened, and everything changed. The French Revolution began in 1789, and its effect on Napoleon's career cannot be overstated. Before the Revolution, the French military officer corps was dominated by aristocracy. Promotion required noble birth, family connections, and the right social relationships. Talent was useful but secondary. A brilliant officer from a minor family could expect to rise, slowly, carefully, within limits. The revolution decapitated the aristocracy. Literally, in many cases, the officers who dominated the French military either fled the country, were arrested, or were guillotined. Overnight, the French army had a massive shortage of experienced, competent officers, and a new political system that was, at least in theory, based on merit rather than birth. For Napoleon, this was the opening of a lifetime. His first major moment came at the siege of Toulon in 1793. Toulon, a major French port, had surrendered to British and Spanish forces in a royalist revolt. The French Revolutionary Army was trying to retake it and failing. Napoleon, then a 24-year-old artillery captain who had essentially inserted himself into the siege operations by being relentlessly useful, identified the key tactical problem. The Allies were holding a fortified position called Fort Mulgrave that controlled the harbor. Take Fort Mulgrave, and the Allied fleet would have to withdraw. The Allied fleet withdrawing meant Toulon would fall. He recommended the attack. His superiors approved it. He led part of the assault personally, was wounded in the thigh by a bayonet, and the fort fell. The Allied fleet withdrew. Toulon fell to the French within days. Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general at 24. From Toulon, his rise accelerated with a speed that contemporary observers found almost disorienting. He suppressed a royalist uprising in Paris in 1795 with what he famously described as a whiff of grapeshot, using cannon fire against the crowd with a directness that ended the revolt in hours and made him the hero of the revolutionary government. In 1796, he was given command of the French army of Italy, a force that was undersupplied, underfed, and demoralized. He arrived, assessed the situation, gave a speech that contemporary accounts describe as electrifying, and within days began a campaign that would make him famous across Europe. The Italian campaign of 1796–97 was Napoleon at his most brilliant, fast, aggressive, psychologically sophisticated, constantly keeping his enemies off. Balance, he defeated Piedmont so quickly, it sued for peace within weeks. He then turned on the Austrians and hit them in a series of engagements. Lodi, Arcola, Rivoli. That demonstrated a tactical flexibility and speed that Austrian commanders simply couldn't match. In Lodi, he personally led the assault across a bridge under heavy fire, fighting alongside his soldiers. The army gave him a nickname after Lodi, Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal, not an insult, a term of affection. He was fighting with them, not behind them. By the end of the Italian campaign, Napoleon had forced Austria to the negotiating table, dramatically redrawn the map of northern Italy, and made himself the most famous general in France. He was 27 years old. The Egyptian campaign that followed in 1798–99 was less militarily successful. The British Navy under Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, stranding Napoleon's army in Egypt. But Napoleon managed it politically with extraordinary skill, keeping the worst news from reaching France and returning home at exactly the right moment to exploit a political crisis. In November 1799, in a coup that he helped engineer, the revolutionary government was overthrown. Napoleon became first consul of France. He was 30 years old. He had gone from obscure Corsican artillery lieutenant to ruler of France in 15 years. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France in a ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral. He took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head himself, a deliberate, theatrical statement that his power came from no one but himself. Pope Pius VII had traveled to Paris specifically for the ceremony. He did not get to do the crowning. He sat and watched Napoleon do it himself. That image tells you almost everything about Napoleon's relationship with established authority. But here is the thing that most people miss about Napoleon. Because the battles are so dramatic and the political story is so compelling, he was also one of the most consequential administrators in the history of Western civilization. The Napoleonic Code, the legal framework Napoleon commissioned and oversaw between 1800 and 1804, is arguably his most lasting achievement, more durable than any of his military victories. It established legal equality regardless of birth, codified property rights, guaranteed religious tolerance, and created a clear, rational legal system to replace the chaotic patchwork of feudal laws and royal decrees that had governed France before the Revolution. The Napoleonic Code is the foundation of the legal systems of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Quebec, Louisiana, and dozens of other countries that were influenced by French law. When you deal with certain property laws in Louisiana today, you are operating within a framework that Napoleon built. His legal reform outlasted his empire by 2 centuries and counting. He reorganized French education, creating the Lick-Fay system of secondary schools that still exists in France. He established the Bank of France to stabilize the currency and finance the state. He negotiated the Concordat of 1801 with the Catholic Church, ending the revolutionary government's chaotic relationship with religion and establishing a workable peace between the French state and the papacy. He built roads. He reformed taxation. He reorganized the bureaucracy. He created the Legion of Honor, which still exists, as a merit-based system for recognizing achievement regardless of birth. The man who crossed the Alps with an army also ran one of the most administratively productive governments in French history, simultaneously. He slept 4 hours a night. He dictated letters and orders at an extraordinary pace. His secretaries struggled to keep up. He had the ability to compartmentalize multiple problems simultaneously that observers described as almost inhuman. On the battlefield, his genius was in what military historians call the strategy of the central position and the corps system. He organized his army into self-sufficient corps, large units of 20,000 to 30,000 men that could march, fight, and supply themselves independently. This allowed him to move faster than his enemies, who were using older organizational systems, while maintaining the ability to concentrate overwhelming force at the decisive point, at the decisive moment. His operational pattern was consistent and devastatingly effective. Divide the enemy, get between their forces, defeat them in detail before they could concentrate. He fought the same basic battle dozens of times, and almost always won because the underlying logic was sound, and he executed it with a speed and precision that his opponents couldn't match. Austerlitz in 1805 is considered his masterpiece, a battle against an Austro-Russian force that outnumbered him, where he deliberately weakened his own right flank to invite an attack, then shattered the attacking force with a decisive blow at their exposed center. Napoleon had predicted the enemy's move the night before the battle and planned the response in advance. It worked exactly as he anticipated. At the heights of his power around 1807 to 1808, Napoleon controlled or influenced most of continental Europe. France, Italy, Spain, the German states, Poland, all were either directly ruled by Napoleon, governed by family members he'd placed on thrones, or allied with him under terms he dictated. He had, in roughly a decade, gone from first consul to the dominant political force on the continent. The Holy Roman Empire, which had existed in some form for 1,000 years, was dissolved in 1806, partly as a consequence of his campaigns. He was not yet 40 years old. Here is where it gets painful. Because Napoleon, who was genuinely brilliant, made a series of decisions between 1808 and 1812 that were so strategically catastrophic that historians have spent 2 centuries trying to explain them. Spain, 1808, Napoleon decided to put his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, removing the existing Bourbon monarchy. His reasoning was strategic. He wanted a reliable ally controlling the Iberian Peninsula. His execution was a disaster. The Spanish people did not want to be liberated by France. They responded with one of the first modern guerrilla insurgencies in European history. the Peninsular War, which would drain French resources, men, and money for 6 straight years. Wellington's British forces in Portugal provided professional military opposition, while Spanish guerrillas made the countryside ungovernable. Napoleon called Spain his bleeding ulcer. He was right. The Peninsular War tied down somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 French soldiers for years, soldiers who weren't available for campaigns elsewhere. The strategic calculation had been simple. The execution was completely wrong because it failed to account for the possibility that the Spanish population would simply refuse to cooperate with being conquered. Russia. 1812, this is the one that broke everything. Napoleon's continental system, his economic blockade designed to strangle Britain by closing European ports to British trade, required every European power to participate. Russia had agreed to it at the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. By 1810, Russia was quietly abandoning it because the economic damage to Russia was simply too severe. Russian nobles were furious about the loss of trade revenue. Napoleon decided he needed to force Russia back into the system. He assembled the Grande Armée, the largest army he had ever commanded, somewhere between 450,000 and 680,000 men, drawn from across the French Empire and its allied states, and marched into Russia in June 1812. The Russians did not cooperate with being defeated. Russian strategy, under General Kutuzov, was to avoid the decisive engagement Napoleon needed, while drawing the French deeper into Russian territory. The French won battles, including the brutal Battle of Borodino, the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars, which killed or wounded somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 men from both sides, but couldn't force a Russian surrender. Napoleon reached Moscow in September. He expected Alexander I to negotiate. Alexander didn't negotiate. He abandoned the city. Moscow burned, apparently set by the Russians themselves, and Napoleon sat in a burned-out city, waiting for a peace offer that never came, as Russian winter began to close in around him. He waited 5 weeks. No offer came. He turned around and retreated. The retreat from Moscow was one of the greatest military disasters in history. The Russian winter, Russian cavalry, harassing the flanks, disease, starvation, and exhaustion killed soldiers at a rate that is still staggering to contemplate. Of the roughly 400,000 men who crossed into Russia, estimates suggest fewer than 100,000 crossed back out in any functional condition. The Grande Armée was effectively destroyed. Napoleon left his army before the retreat was complete, returning to Paris to manage the political fallout. He raised new armies. France had been at war long enough that this required conscripting increasingly younger men. But the new armies were not the experienced veterans who had fought at Austerlitz and Jena. The quality was there in terms of courage. The training and experience were not. The Sixth Coalition, Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and various German states, formed against Napoleon in 1813, united by the shared experience of how dangerous leaving him in power had become. At the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, the largest battle in European history up to that point, involving over 500,000 soldiers, Napoleon was decisively defeated. He retreated to France. The coalition invaded. Paris fell in March 1814. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to the island of Elba, off the coast of Tuscany. He was given sovereignty over the island, a small honor guard, and a pension. He was 44 years old. The greatest military career in modern European history appeared to be over. It was not over. Napoleon spent 10 months on Elba. He reorganized the island's administration, reviewed its mines and agriculture, and watched events in France with growing interest. The Bourbon monarchy had been restored. Louis XVIII, brother of the guillotined Louis XVI, was now King of France, and by early 1815 it was clear that the restoration was going badly. Royalist nobles were returning from exile with a sense of grievance and entitlement that alienated the population. Veterans of Napoleon's armies were being pushed aside. The reforms of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods were being quietly rolled back. France was not happy. The army especially was not happy, Napoleon noticed. On the 26th of February 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba with approximately 1,100 soldiers, boarded ships, and landed on the southern coast of France near Cannes on the 1st of March. The French government sent troops to arrest him. Napoleon walked toward the troops alone, opened his coat, and said, according to legend. And this story is almost certainly at least partly true. Soldiers of the 5th Regiment, if any of you wishes to shoot his emperor, here I am. Nobody shot him. The troops joined him instead. Then the next regiment, then the next. Then Marshal Ney, who had promised Louis XVIII he would bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage, rode to meet Napoleon and switched sides. Napoleon entered Paris on the 20th of March 1815 without firing a shot. Louis XVIII had fled. The Bourbon Restoration was over. Napoleon was emperor again. The coalition powers, meeting at the Congress of Vienna, immediately declared Napoleon an outlaw and mobilized their armies. They assembled forces under Wellington in Belgium and B.L. Faycher's Prussians, with Russian and Austrian armies marching to join them. Napoleon's strategic situation was clear. He had to knock out the British and Prussian forces in Belgium before the Russians and Austrians could arrive to join them, then deal with the remainder from a position of victory. His plan was sound. His execution on the 18th of June, 1815, at a village south of Brussels called Waterloo, was not. The reasons for the French defeat at Waterloo have been argued about ever since. Napoleon was not well, possibly suffering from a stomach illness, possibly from hemorrhoids, severe enough to affect his ability to ride and inspect positions, possibly from a kind of mental fatigue that affected his decision-making. He delayed the start of the battle to let the ground dry after rain, which gave the Prussians time to march to Wellington's relief. His corps commander, Marshal Ney, made catastrophic errors, launching massive cavalry charges against unbroken British infantry squares at the wrong moment, wasting the French cavalry for no gain. Napoleon's handling of his Imperial Guard, held in reserve for most of the day, committed too late to change the outcome, has been guessed by every military historian since. At around 7 p.m., the Imperial Guard advanced against the British line. The British Guard stood up from behind the ridge where they'd been sheltering and fired at point-blank range. The Imperial Guard, which had never been repulsed in the entire history of Napoleon's wars, broke and ran. The word went through the French army like a shock. La Garde recule. The Guard is retreating. Everything collapsed. The French army disintegrated. The Prussians, arriving in force, turned the retreat into a rout. Napoleon was defeated. His second reign, the 100 Days, was over. He abdicated again on the 22nd of June, 1815, 4 days after Waterloo. He tried to sail to America. The British Navy was waiting. He surrendered to the British and was sent to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, 1,200 miles from the nearest land, from which escape was essentially impossible. He lived there for 6 years, dictating his memoirs and arguing with his British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, about the conditions of his captivity. He died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51. The official cause was stomach cancer. Some historians have proposed arsenic poisoning. Traces of arsenic have been found in preserved hair samples, though whether this was deliberate or accidental environmental exposure remains debated. The height question. Napoleon was not particularly short for his time. Contemporary records and measurements taken after his death put his height at around 5 feet 6 or 7 inches in modern measurements, roughly average for a French male of his era, possibly slightly above average. So where did the short Napoleon myth come from? 2 places. First, the British. Propaganda has been a feature of warfare throughout history, and the British were extraordinarily good at it during the Napoleonic Wars. The caricaturist James Gillray drew Napoleon consistently as a tiny, temperamental figure. And Gillray's cartoons were so widely circulated and so brilliantly done that the image stuck. Little Boney became a fixture of British popular culture during the wars. Second, a unit conversion problem. Napoleon was often recorded as 5'2" in French units, but the French inch of the time was longer than the British inch. When the measurement was converted without accounting for this difference, the result was a height that seemed unusually short by British standards. He was also surrounded by his Imperial Guard, who had a minimum height requirement of 5'8", making him look shorter by comparison in many public appearances. The short Napoleon is one of history's most successful pieces of wartime propaganda, still circulating 2 centuries later. What Napoleon actually was, what his legacy actually amounts to, is genuinely complicated. He was a man who rose from nothing to the summit of the most powerful civilization of his era through a combination of extraordinary talent, relentless work, and the historical accident of being born at exactly the moment when the old order collapsed and merit suddenly had room to operate. He built things that lasted: the legal codes, the educational systems, the administrative reforms, and destroyed things that mattered, including hundreds of thousands of lives across a decade and a half of nearly continuous warfare. He democratized Europe in some ways, spreading revolutionary principles of legal equality, dismantling feudal structures, while installing his own relatives as kings and making himself emperor. The contradictions are real and not easily resolved. What is certain is that the world he left behind was permanently different from the one he'd been born into. The map of Europe was redrawn. The old dynastic order that had governed the continent for centuries was destabilized in ways it never fully recovered from. The revolutionary principles he spread, intentionally and unintentionally, fed into the nationalist movements that shaped the 19th and 20th centuries. He is, by any serious measure, one of the most consequential human beings in the history of the modern world. Not because he was purely good or purely evil, but because what he did mattered to more people, in more places, for longer than almost anyone else who has ever lived. He conquered all of Europe, he lost it all in 100 days, and then, somehow, the ideas he spread kept winning for 200 years after his death. Not bad for a kid from Corsica with an accent. That was Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who crowned himself emperor in front of the Pope, won 60 battles, conquered most of Europe, got exiled to an island, escaped, came back, lost everything in 100 days, got exiled to a different and much more remote island, and still managed to reshape modern civilization from beyond the grave. Also, he was not short. Spread the word. If this video hit you the way it should, if you came in thinking you knew Napoleon and left realizing you only knew the cartoon version, like this video right now, it is the single most effective thing you can do to help this channel grow. Subscribe to Sketchy Past if you haven't already. Ring the bell. We are building something real here. Video by video, week by week. And the momentum is showing in the numbers. Next episode, World War I. The war that nobody wanted. Everybody started. And the peace treaty that ended it was so badly designed that it directly caused World War II 20 years later. If that is not the definition of a catastrophic sequel, I don't know what is. Stay sketchy. See you in the next one.